Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Archaeology Show. TAS goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories about archaeology and the history around us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Show, episode 217.
On today's show, we talk about prehistoric Puerto Ricans, a bone punch board, and an underwater cemetery.
Let's dig a little deeper and hopefully find some more bodies, clothes, and gravestones. That's the cycle of life. Welcome to the Archaeology Show.
Hello.
Got a news episode for you
Yes.
from not stupid hot Palm Springs anymore.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's actually really nice. I was sitting outside working today, taking advantage of the not too hot sunshine.
Yeah.
This is what we were hoping for when we decided to come here.
This is what it normally is.
Yeah.
Until like August or July.
Until later in the summer.
Then it's 106 every day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the park we're at actually closes in a couple of weeks because like nobody wants to be here.
Yeah, why would you come here in the summer? I mean, if you live here, that's one thing, but like visiting here in an RV doesn't seem like the best choice when it's super hot out.
Not so much. Not so much.
No.
But visiting the island of Puerto Rico seemed like a good idea for the last like almost 3,000 years.
Yeah, I would love to visit the island of Puerto Rico for sure.
I know, never been.
Amazing.
Yeah, in fact, the article that we're going to talk about here, well, we'll get into it, but the first line is just like riddled with controversy for me, and I'm surprised they didn't get into it. But anyway, let's talk about that in a minute.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
well, this article is called Oldest Human Remains from Puerto Rico Contradict Idea of Simple Island Nomads.
yes.
And that was published in Science. And they also did us the lovely favor of linking to the PLOS One article, which is where the actual like scientific study was published.
Right.
Yeah. So there's some good links there for you to go check it out. I'd say look at the pictures, but there's not like a huge amount to look at because, you know, putting pictures of human remains into articles is not really like the thing to do for a lot of reasons. So they don't have any of those, fortunately.
Putting them in the back of your car is also not the thing to do. But again, we'll get to that.
Yeah, we will get to
Let's
that.
do a little
I
history.
was like, what are you objecting to in this article? But now I remember.
Why don't you give us a little history of Puerto Rico first?
Yeah, I didn't know anything about Puerto Rico. I don't know about you. I just had not ever like considered the prehistory of Puerto Rico at all. So we wanted to do like a quick like recap of it. So the oldest evidence that we have is from about 4,000 years ago, and it is the Ortuarid culture, which is from the Orinoco region in South America, which is like roughly the Venezuela, northern Colombia area. They arrived to the island approximately 4,000 years ago. They kind of jumped down island chains basically until they finally got there. Mm-hmm. And then they were there for a while, occupied the island, and many thousands of years later, around 430 to 250 BCE, the Saladoid culture arrived, also from the same region in South America.
Okay.
So they kind of followed the paths of their ancestors, hopping these island chains and eventually reaching Puerto Rico.
Did you read if there was evidence that like there was a gap in people there, or is it just like continuous influx?
I think it was pretty I think it was a gap. Like the first guys got there and then that culture flourished there for a while, not necessarily with an influx of new people. And then a distinctly different culture arrived that is related to these Saladoid peoples. So those guys were there for a while, and they were there when between the 7th and 11th centuries CE, the Taino culture developed, and they went on to dominate the island. They were there when Columbus and the Spanish arrived in 1493, and they were a group of like 30 to 60,000 people, basically.
Like 30 people to 60,000 people? That's a pretty big range.
30,000 to 60,000 people.
There were between 0 and a lot of people there. That's the official estimate.
You're so helpful. Anyway, so they were in conflict with the raiding Carib people from the Antilles Islands. So at the time that the Spanish arrived. And so that combined with the European diseases that were brought by the Spanish basically caused that population to decline. I don't think they really put up much of a fight when the Spanish sort of took over the island. Sure. And it really became like an outpost for Spanish conquering that occurred into the rest of the islands and probably into Mexico as well. It was sort of like that first stop for ships that were coming in from Spain.
But we can see the DNA from these people in modern descendants in Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So they definitely like had an impact on, the descendants on the island today. And they also, I love this, they give us the word for hammock.
Nice.
So that came from the Taino people.
So hammock is literally a word for like a net between the trees?
Yeah, like cord or string or ropes hung between trees, basically.
I wonder what came first, because hammocks kind of look like fishing nets.
Right. They just gave us the name. They did not give us the thing.
Yeah.
The thing developed independently in many different coastal cultures around the world. But the word hammock came from these people. And it's because there's a Spanish word for it, like hamoka or something like that. And that became the English word.
I want a hamoka right now.
I might be wrong about that. So Spanish speakers don't crucify me. But there is like a Spanish word that became the English word. And that's where we get it from.
All right.
So all of these different groups that occupied the islands over these many, these 4,000 years or so, they had been thought of as like roaming nomadic fisher type of cultures. And it was kind of presumed that they were not like super complex societies. They were just like nomadic, hunter-gatherer, following the food. Yeah, that type of thing.
Yeah. So that evidence of their nomadic lifestyles is really what they got from the limited archaeological record on the island. It's just that we don't know a whole lot about them. And this is what the conclusion was made. Yeah,
we'll talk about it in a minute, but the preservation there is not great for archaeology. So there's just not a lot of good sites that have a lot of data associated with them.
And that's why this article is important, and the actual journal article that it's based on, which was published in PLOS ONE. It's open source and is linked in our show notes. So that's cool. But, I was getting to to me, something that I'm surprised they even wrote about. But it's the first line in the article is directly, over 2 days in 2019, William Pessel drove a truck containing 35 carefully packed boxes from Virginia to Florida. At night, the University of Miami bioarchaeologist brought the boxes inside his hotel room for safekeeping. This was no ordinary cargo. Inside were the oldest human remains yet found in Puerto Rico.
Okay, let's give some context to this. So the original excavations were carried out for a construction company in the 90s. That company went out of business, and the guy who was in charge of the sites ended up with these artifacts, these remains that he just kind of didn't know what to do with.
Yeah.
And it was in the 90s, so I don't think that the laws were as good or as strict around what to do with it. Maybe Puerto Rico wasn't stepping in with what to do. I'm not really sure what fell through right there. But basically, this guy, Daniel Koski Karelia, ended up with these boxes of remains. And to his credit, he just packaged them up well and preserved them well in boxes that were in his house.
Yeah.
Well, 3 decades later, he teamed up with William Pessel, who's the guy from the beginning of the article, who's a bioarchaeologist. And he is the one who wanted to re-examine these remains and see what we can learn from them. So in this article, and we can talk about our opinions about that, but it seems like they really tiptoed around who did what and what they should have done or not have done. And it sounds like everybody agrees this original guy should never have left Puerto Rico with human remains that belong to the Puerto Rican government, essentially.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he did such a great job of making sure that they were protected and preserved and now can be studied today. It's like people don't want to fault him for it too much. So that in the article anyway, they just kind of tiptoed around it. I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think he should be given more?
Well, it sounded like he didn't have any other options. Right?
Yeah, that's the way they framed it in the article.
Yeah, I mean, he probably should have talked to the government beforehand, but it sounded like there were no other options, really.
Yeah.
And, guess to everybody's credit, they're not losing their minds over this, and they're saying, get your analysis done.
Yeah.
Do your thing, because this is where you're at the University of Miami in Florida.
Well,
and
actually, he's going on from there to Puerto Rico, or has gone on from there.
And that's what I said.
Yeah.
They said in the article that when you're done with this, basically bring them back.
Yeah, and they will stay in Puerto Rico.
And they will stay in Puerto Rico, yeah.
And there's one Puerto Rican archaeologist in the article is quoted as saying, they never should have left in the first place.
Yeah,
so that's as close as they're getting to like condemning the actions of the person in the 90s.
Well, that's as close as the article author of this.
Yes, the author of the article is getting at that. But
yeah, she may not have gone deeply into that. Who knows?
Yeah. But. Yeah, I think it is tricky because you have to be happy that there's something to study, but also like maybe that should have been done right in the first place. I feel very torn about it. Anyway, so that's the drama behind the remains and how they got to where they were and why they're being studied today.
Yeah, so let's talk about the site. It's a site known as Cabo Rojo, and it was in southwestern Puerto Rico. Again, 1993. There were the remains of 5 individuals found, along with tools, food remains, and other artifacts, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And this is kind of amazing in this area, and part of the reason why the archaeological record is so poor, at least from a human remains standpoint, is because it's such a hot, humid climate that bones and more than likely wood and other stuff too,
anything organic, really,
just deteriorates really quickly. So there's just not a lot of burials that they've seen in excavations on this island. So in fact, less than 20 burials even exist from this entire time period.
Yeah, totally.
Because the bones are, bones.
And there were other remains with the bones too, so I'm not sure exactly what they used here.
Yeah, but they did some radiocarbon dating, so carbon-14 dating, and that revealed that the 5 individuals in particular lived between approximately 1900 BCE and 800 BCE, which is...
That's a huge spread, right?
It's a huge spread for carbon dating.
Yeah. So I do, and I think this is, again, going back to the whole, 30 years ago, guy disappeared with remains in the night or something kind of shady like that. But I don't know how much context they have about the excavation itself, how close these burials were together, the association between them,
And here's the thing. Carbon dating wasn't brand new in 1993, but it was still pretty new for archaeology, right? So collection methods, especially early construction collection methods in Puerto Rico. I'm pretty sure Section 106 still holds in Puerto Rico. I think so. It's a territory of the United States. Section 106 is the law that defines the mandatory, basically cultural exploration of sites that are going to have a federal action against them. So this construction company, it doesn't really say what they were constructing.
It does not.
So they may not have been required to do a study like that. Yeah. But to their credit, there was an archaeological excavation done. So I guess there's that.
Yeah.
But so that's probably why the radiocarbon dating is not super great.
Yeah.
Because was it contaminated? Was it, how do we even trust those dates?
It does make you wonder how much trust you can put in those dates. Yeah.
Another cool thing is, again, the science of this whole thing is pretty neat. You can look at the nitrogen and carbon isotopes in bones to learn about the diet.
Yeah.
And what they found by studying that is that they ate a mix of seafood, land-based animals, and potentially maize, which is, you would think that would be fairly obvious on Puerto Rico, but we have evidence for it.
Yeah.
It also makes me think that the ice cream I had last night is in my bones as some sort of isotope that somebody's gonna be like, this fatty.
This guy. He was eating some ice cream.
This guy. Ice cream and coffee. That's literally what your bones is made of.
Oh, I don't think so. But the maize in particular is interesting, and it's one of those things that's helping deconstruct the preconceived notions.
Yeah.
Because maize it's like corn, right? And it's the kind of thing that you domesticate and to get something that is edible, probably. So it shows that they might have been experimenting with domestication. Either way, they clearly had a very diverse diet, which indicates that they might have been a more complex society. And the other thing that sort of contributes to that too is that these remains span 500 to 1,000 years. And so one reason why that time span might be so large is that maybe they were coming back to this place, different groups, different nomadic groups came back to the same place to bury their dead. So if you have a touchstone, a place that you always go back to, it kind of indicates a slightly more complex society.
Yeah, I'm not buying that.
No?
I'm not buying it because unless they dig up the whole island or that whole area, if that were actually true, then they would have thousands of bodies there. Like, why would there only be 5? Like, you would bury somebody in, and then 200 years later, you're like, hey, did we bury Fred back there? That's not going to happen. Yeah,
because like the flip side of the argument is that this just happens to be a really nice place to bury humans for whatever reason, and other humans later down the road looked at it and saw the same features for what they were.
And here's the thing: Puerto Rico's not a very big island, so if people lived there continuously, wouldn't kind of just like anywhere be a good place to bury somebody? You'd think the whole island would be littered with bodies if people lived there that long.
I don't know. Again, it goes back to questions with the original excavation. Like, was there more area to be excavated that would fill in those time gaps with more burials, but they got a building put over them or a road or something, and now we don't have access to them? I don't have any more history about what that construction looked like,
Yeah. I suppose the only thing we can say with confidence is that they weren't running around that island naked. Much like the people of Spain 39,000 years ago. Back in a minute.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals. That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Welcome back to episode 217 of the Archaeology Show. And we are talking about ancient tailors. This article is from the Smithsonian, and we have a link in the show notes. We also have a link to the open access article from Science Advances, which is super cool.
Yeah, another good one where they actually linked to the source article. So that was great.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's good pictures too. Definitely look at the pictures in the Smithsonian article, but also in the open access one, there's even more photos. So you can really see what they're talking about.
Yeah, the Smithsonian article really only has the one, which is actually
the most important one.
Yeah, kind of spoiler alert. Yeah, it's right on the top.
Yeah.
But anyway, this article is titled, "This 39,600, that's oddly specific, year old bone may have been used by prehistoric tailors."
Yeah. And you might wonder, how could they know?
Yeah.
So the bone fragment is from a site that is nearly 40,000 years old, of course, and it has puncture holes in it. And they think that those puncture holes might have been used, basically this piece of bone might have been used to stabilize leather when somebody was punching holes into it in order to potentially then sew a garment together. Now, you might have heard in all of that there's a lot of assumptions being made here.
Yep, and I don't buy it, and I'll tell you why.
We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's first talk about the artifact itself.
Okay. So
it was discovered at a site in Catalonia, Spain, which is about 12 and a half miles south of Barcelona.
It's Barcelona.
How did I not know you were going to say that? Barcelona. You're pretentious. Anyway, so the theory is, like I said, they could hold the leather over the bone and basically stabilize it. And then they're taking a chisel, which would have probably been some kind of lithic or antler or whatever. They tried a bunch of different things, and we'll get to why they decided it was probably flint. But you can use that to like punch the holes through the leather or the hide or whatever it is.
So I got to describe the artifact here real quick.
Yeah.
It's about 10 centimeters long, give or take, which is about 6 inches or so. I didn't actually do that math, but it's got to be around there somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's a flat piece of bone. So this would have been from, some sort of mammal. I'm not really sure what it is. Did they say?
Yeah, they did. They said it is something either bovid.
Yeah. Oh, that's right.
Which would be
cowish.
Yeah, but they didn't have cow then, so it was antelope, sheep, buffalo, or maybe even horse.
Well, I was thinking more like where the bone is.
Oh, it's a hip bone.
Hip?
They think it's hip bone.
Okay, I was thinking hip or scapula.
Yeah, hip from one of those.
Either way, it's flat, and there's a line of indentations on it, a clear line of indentations, and if you really did put a piece of fabric on that, and you punched a hole in every single one of those places where there's, in the fabric, where every one of the places where there's indentation on this bone. Notice I said indentation, not a hole all the way through the bone. It's just an indentation.
Just the indentation.
I'm thinking like these hides are actually really thick
Yeah.
They're not super thin. They're really thick. And you're laying the hide on here. What are you doing? Like move it around until you feel the indentation? Like why wouldn't it be further or deeper in?
Okay, hold on. That's what I thought too, but I don't think that that's how they mean. I don't think that the piece of bone is a template for where to put the holes. They think that they just put the bone underneath whatever they're trying to punch through. And then looking at the leather, they're like, okay, I want a line of holes here. So they went bam, 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 bam. And that created the indentations.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. So this was used once?
Yeah. Once or a couple times. So
it looks like once.
Going on, continuing with your description, there's 28 puncture marks and they're in 2 distinct groups. The first one is the ones that you're talking about, which is 10 like remarkably similar, as they call it, punctures in a row, indicating that they probably were made by the same tool. And then the second group is a group of 15 that are not aligned, basically. They're not perfectly together, but they are similar. And then there's 3 extras that are smaller, isolated, and not really part of either of those 2 groups. So it's not as if these marks on the bone were something that they were trying to line up the leather with. They couldn't see through. They couldn't, none of that.
I don't think
it wasn't like a template. It made it so that the tool that they were punching the leather with wouldn't hit their leg or the table or whatever it is that they were doing it on. It was just a stabilizer on the backside.
I get all that. I'm just floored by the apparent disposable nature of this. I would have thought they would have used the same piece if it worked well over and over and over again, but it's clear they only used it maybe 2 or 3 times, or they used it once and just kept slipping out of their knee and they had to reorient it or something like that. But I guess if it was something that was relatively disposable, that would make sense because they're eating meat a lot.
They're eating meat a lot.
And they have high access to this number of bones.
They do. And there's no need to carry something like that around with them. Because my other thought was, how often are they even making a garment or clothing, right? Like, I'm guessing that was a couple times a year sort of situation rather than depending on a person. I mean, they called him a tailor in the article to like capture minds and imaginations.
Yeah, but it would have been just like anybody.
It would have just been like dude or woman who needed a cape.
Well, I don't know about a cape. Probably a pair of shoes. Those probably wore out.
Maybe.
Something to cover your feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would guess this would be used for. I mean, obviously, clothing as well. We'll talk about clothing in a minute, but I guess I would assume that everybody knew how to repair their own things.
Yeah.
And even create their own things.
Yeah.
Because it would just be knowledge you had to have to live back then.
Yeah.
It wouldn't make a lot of sense 40,000 years ago for you to divide that labor because they weren't necessarily living in stratified, structured communities.
Like big enough groups for somebody to specialize in being a clothing maker. Like not yet. This was too early for that.
Maybe Joe or Jane Caveman was a little better at it than somebody else. Yeah. So they're like, hey, you do this because you're awesome at it.
Yeah.
And that's probably how specialization was formed. But I'm really just surprised by what seems like a consumable item. And maybe it's something that was found and used expediently just because they were like, hey, I need to fix my shoe. And there's some animal remains. I'm going to go ahead and do this real quick.
Yeah, for sure.
It was found with other stuff, but I wonder if that's temporary nature of that site.
Yeah. And I don't think we've said what the name of something like this is, but it's called a punch board, basically. And I think that people that work with leather and really tough materials like that still use a similar type of thing, a backing essentially to catch the sharp implement as you're punching holes into leather or whatever.
Which sends my mind into whole other realms of discovery too, because it makes me think stuff like they're just like, oh yeah, it's a punch board. Sure, no big deal, right?
Right.
Yeah. It makes me think like, how many times, even in the same area, how many times was stuff like this invented over and over and over again?
For sure.
Because there's only one really great way to do it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like somebody was trying to punch holes in leather and they stabbed themselves in the leg a few times before they stuffed something under there and said, holy crap, that works better.
Yeah, for sure.
And then that knowledge was possibly lost, and somebody else had to figure it out. And it's just like thousands of times across the planet, this was probably figured out.
Yeah,
the Native Americans had lots of hide-based products. They had to have done something like this as well.
They must have. And I think we do have examples of this from more modern groups. And the thing that interests me the most is from a like function perspective. And they did do this. They did try this through like some experimental archaeology, which we'll get to in a minute. But I think like having it be a piece of bone be what is catching the tool as it comes through the leather is perfect, because a rock is too hard, you know, like it'd probably hurt your hand or break or whatever.
Bone would have some give.
Yeah, bone has give. Wood might be nice too, but maybe wood is too soft depending on what is around. So anyway, I love the idea of like trying a bunch of different materials and settling on, you know, an antelope hip bone being the best choice. It's really cool. So just really quick, I love talking about clothing in general, as you know, and it fits into that missing majority category of artifact, which is part of the reason why this article really jumped out at me. We just don't have it. It degrades, it goes away, it's gone. And most artifacts like this are really, we just don't have them from this long ago.
I know how much you like talking about clothing. The Target fashion show a few nights ago was exemplifying that fact.
Yeah. Well, I'm not talking about clothing for me, but I do like to make clothing. You know, I'm a knitter and a sewer and all that. But
Sewer.
Well, I have a sewing machine. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, so these things, we know that they had them. They had to have, clothing in particular, because it was so cold. They had to have.
Yeah.
But we don't have direct evidence going back 39,000 years. It just is gone. So
yeah, that stuff doesn't last underground.
No, it doesn't. And just for context, again, the oldest known fragments of fabric are like 10,000 years old,
which is still pretty impressive.
And
more than likely, I don't know anything about it, but more than likely found in a cave environment or something like that.
Cave or somewhere arid where it could preserve properly.
Dry and cold.
Yes, exactly. But here, certainly not. And being this old at 39,000 years, definitely not. We don't have any kind of fabric. So we're just sort of left to draw assumptions from the surrounding implements when we find them.
Right. Yeah, they kind of, again, go to the same realms that pretty much every researcher goes to when they see something that, I don't know, is either uniform or different, or they can't explain it, something like that. But this one group of impressions that, or marks, I guess, that is very, very obvious on the bone.
Yeah.
What I like is they look square, so they were punched with an implement that had some sort of a defined end shape on it, right? And also they're of almost uniform distance apart.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's that for?
Yeah. Well, all that means that it must have been something. Or
somebody was just really good at making seams. You know, I mean, it didn't have to be like they're speculating on what is he used for, you know, recording something a certain number of times or doing something like that. But why would they have to put them so evenly spaced?
Right.
You know?
Yeah, that's why they sort of disregarded the thought that it could be like art maybe, or some sort of recording method for something, counting something maybe, but they sort of rejected all that because the rest of the bone is not manipulated at all.
Yeah.
And they then
wasn't special.
Yeah, exactly. So they wanted to test the theory that maybe it was for punching holes in leather, and they did that by basically reproducing this with a similar bone and a piece of leather, and they tried a variety of things, including antler, bone, horn, stone tools. They tried all of that to see what would make the holes that they were seeing in the actual artifacts.
Yeah.
And the flint tool that they tried was it made remarkably similar holes.
Yeah.
Punctures, I guess, in the experimental setting. So yeah.
All right. Well, I like where they're going with this. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's
still a little bit skeptical, because it does kind of seem like they're drawing conclusions where they're like, oh, look, I can make that too. And like they did it, but that doesn't mean it's the only way it could have happened or the only reason it could have happened. So
I would definitely say this is one thing that could have produced those types of marks. And that's one thing it could have been used for, but there could have been completely different things that we don't even conceive of. Our brains can't even handle, you know, of how they would have used this. Yeah,
there could have been other reasons, and you certainly shouldn't stop on just one. But I think without any more artifacts that look like this, it's going to be very hard to draw any more conclusions. All we can do is have our best guess, which is, as best guesses go, I think that this is a good one.
Right, indeed. Okay, well, we're going to go from there to a cemetery that's underwater with a hospital in Florida, because pretty much all of Florida is going to be underwater at some point, and this has just started early. Back in a minute.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals. That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. and the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zaxby's Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Welcome back to the Archaeology Show. And now we're going to talk about, the topic that I feel like in our lifetimes is going to start getting more and more prevalent. Hey, we were in Florida looking underwater. If you haven't seen the show Extrapolations on Apple TV Plus yet, it's about climate change, and each episode over like 8 or 9 episodes takes place like a decade apart.
Yeah.
I think the last episode takes place in 2070. But it's about dramatic climate change, and like in the first episode it's like 2030 and Florida's already got massive controls because everything's underwater.
Yeah, like southern Florida specifically. And we know because we worked on that site in Miami, and we were pumping out water 24/7 once we got not even that far down. I mean, and we would, before we got the pump going, we would show up in the morning and our entire, the entire area that we work in will be full of water, and we'd have to wait for the water to get pumped out. So.
Or when whoever was supposed to go fill the pump generator with gas didn't do it, then we also woke up with, 10 feet of water in our excavation site.
Which I know we've mentioned this before, but can you believe that part of our job was getting up at 1 a.m. to go put gas in a generator? Like, that's insane when I think about it now. I would definitely not do that.
Can you believe that for some reason I never did that?
You didn't? I thought you did it with me. I wouldn't do it by myself. So I think you were my companion one time.
I just don't remember doing it very often.
Yeah. I mean, it was spread out. Like everybody had a different turn. But anyway.
Anyway, Florida is much of Florida, especially central and southern Florida, is really, really close to sea level. Like within, 3 to 10 feet.
Yeah.
Right. It's not very much.
Yeah.
And you go underground, and a lot of, if not all of Florida, again, central to southern Florida, is basically limestone.
Yeah.
And limestone's incredibly porous, and it is just already super saturated with water.
Yeah.
And because of that, if you dig down just a little bit, you hit water. I remember shovel testing in Florida near Lake Okeechobee, and then in some other areas of Florida where I've worked. I mean, you dig down a meter, which is, a little over 3 feet with your shovel, and you're already hitting water, in your sandy unit there.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
You really couldn't do a whole lot because of the water.
Yeah.
But,
and this site in particular that we're about to talk about is actually at Dry Tortugas National Park, which is an island off the coast of Florida. So all of the problems that Florida has, as far as, not problems, but like the geography of Florida and being at sea level, it's even worse, basically, at Dry Tortugas.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole series of islands that this stuff was built on to begin with. So.
Yeah.
But first, the article is called A Grave Under the Ocean. Team finds what could be submerged hospital off Florida Keys. And it's from the Idaho Statesman, which is actually a pretty decent resource.
I know. Seriously, I think we've pulled several articles from them, and they
cover a lot.
They are really good at covering interesting archaeology news stories. It's really cool that they've dedicated a little corner of their publication to that.
Well, they're not stupid. What makes them money, even though, because nobody's buying papers, is clicks.
Yeah, true. And
the more articles you can write, the more clicks you get.
Yeah, they definitely, along with the big ones like Smithsonian and National Geographic, like these guys are kind of up there as far as breaking this kind of news.
Yeah,
or sharing this kind of news, maybe not breaking it, but... So archaeologists found a submerged gravestone off the coast of the Dry Tortugas National Park in Florida. Actually, I guess it is technically part of Dry Tortugas because Dry Tortugas is approximately 70 miles west of Key West, and it's mostly water. There are 7 small islands and then other islands that have since disappeared into the ocean, which is one of the reasons why this grave is underwater.
Yeah, it's a combination of sand, climate change, and hurricanes and inclement weather and stuff like that. Yeah. Which is why a lot of these islands are now underwater. And things just shift in this area.
Yeah. I'm not sure that that's like unnatural for that to have happened. It just shifted over time. I'm sure other ones have popped up too. It's kind of the same idea, right?
Yeah. I mean, we went and put a whole bunch of big heavy buildings on some of these things, which probably helped destabilize them a little bit.
True.
And the fort that's there now is a massive fort.
Yeah. It's
that's
huge.
on there. Yeah. And you can only get to it by boat or seaplane, which is really cool.
Yeah. That is. I've always wanted to go there. And we're such national park junkies, but
well, that'd be a stamp to get.
It would be, but you can't get there unless you get the little like ferry boat thing that goes out there, and it is booked for like months in advance. Remember we tried to go when we were in the Keys. We were going to just like pop down for the day, and we couldn't even get a seat on the boat.
No,
so,
and we looked at seaplane, and it was like $300 to $400 a piece.
Yeah.
You spend the day out there too, because they drop you off in the morning and pick you up in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a unique place to visit, and we'll get there one day. That's much with the RV. But
I know. And the there part of it is Fort Jefferson, which is on Garden Key, and that is the largest of this little island chain there. And the fort was built in the 19th century, actually.
Yeah. And it's one of the largest 19th century forts. Like you said, the place is massive. So what happened is that there was a park ranger who was flying over shallow water in a plane, obviously, in the area. And he basically like saw something that looked like right angles, and it caught his eye because it wasn't right. It wasn't the right shape to be natural to that area. And he was like, what is this? And so they went searching and found that it was a headstone.
Nice.
And so far they found just the one, and it belongs to a man named John Greer, who died November 5th, 1861.
Yeah, they actually have records, and they show the records in the article here with John Greer's line highlighted with that typical like 1800s writing that's impossible to read.
The script, yeah. It's so, I don't even know how they wrote so perfectly. I have such bad chicken scratch. I'm like, I could never have such nice, beautiful flowing lines.
It's because they wrote deliberately.
Yeah, true.
Right?
And it was slow and it was purposeful.
Yeah, they weren't like cranking it out. And they probably had to dip their pen and their quill in the thing every once in a while. They didn't have ballpoint pens.
For sure.
So, it took a while to actually write that. But
yeah,
a team of underwater archaeologists from the park found and documented the gravestone, and it was made of a material called, I'm going to call it gray wacky, but I think it's
gray whack probably, but I like gray wacky.
Gray whack or gray wake. It's the last part is WACKE. I actually never heard that term before.
I hadn't either. Yeah.
But it's actually the same kind of stone material they used to build the first floor of Fort Jefferson.
It looks like some kind of weird concrete amalgamate sort of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe there's crushed up seashell or something in it. I'm not really sure, but
yeah, I don't know if it's concrete because it's carved. It's like rock.
Oh yeah, true.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It does say in the article though that the headstone was carved. It specifically says that.
Yes, it was carved into that sort of typical headstone shape.
Yeah.
And then it was inscribed it again in that lovely like scrolly 19th century script with his name and date of death, which is how we know who it is and when he died.
Yeah. There could be a lot more nearby because the historical evidence says that there was a lot going on back then.
Yeah.
And there was many outbreaks over the years that this fort was in use and people were there of yellow fever and some other stuff because there's a lot of mosquitoes down there, and sometimes it would just like there would be outbreaks, and in order to quarantine people they actually put them on some of these outlying islands from the fort. And I think there is evidence that a hospital was on one of those, like documentary evidence that there was a hospital.
They definitely know that some of these outlier islands were used as quarantine hospitals. So that's why they either think there's a hospital nearby or they have other actual physical evidence. They didn't get more specific in the article, but they are interested in knowing, in addition to John Greer, who else might be buried there. And they are working to find out more about John Greer. All they know is that line from that book that said he was a laborer. That's really all they know about him. So they're just, doing that history thing and trying to figure out who else could have been there.
Yeah, and since this was a military fort, like I said, there are some records here that we can look back and see. The fort was in operation until 1873, and then again as a military hospital from 1890 to 1900. And it was actually used as a military prison during the Civil War.
Yeah,
so,
I think the primary use for it was as a military prison. So you can imagine that prisons need a lot of infrastructure to run properly, right? So you've got the prisoners, but then you have all the people supporting the infrastructure for the prisoners. So you end up with a lot of people, which is why things like yellow fever and other mosquito-borne diseases were able to outbreak the way they did. And then they're on this tiny island with the fort, and they have to get those people that are infected away from everybody else, or else it's going to just spread to everywhere. And I guess they were fortunate enough to have these outlying islands that they could make use of as like quarantine outpost hospitals. Although I imagine it was a really, unfun situation to be in at one of those outlier islands. But yeah.
Yeah, the other islands around there were used essentially by the Navy.
Yeah.
During the Civil War.
Yeah.
To act as not just support for the fort, but what they called a naval coaling outpost, which I think is actually making the coal that they use to burn in naval ships.
Right.
A lighthouse station at one point, and then military training, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All this means there's just a lot of people, a lot more people than you would expect for a really remote island. Remote, especially in terms of the 1800s.
Yeah, for sure.
So the area where they found the headstone has been well documented, and the park is going to continue monitoring it. But it doesn't sound like they're going to do any further excavation or exploration, really, to find out what other resources might be there, because there's just no need to disturb it. It's probably pretty safe, underwater in a protected area. So there's really no need to do any more excavation. But it does sound like they are going to try to continue doing like the historical research aspect of it that they don't need to do excavation for. So
I wouldn't be surprised if there's some pretty decent maps out there somewhere.
Oh,
that show this. I mean, it was military.
Yeah, so, true.
Yeah. And then also, much like you may have seen some of these articles, but there's at least one frame of a fairly large boat that was discovered off the coast of Florida. I want to say it was near Daytona. We didn't have this article up, but it was somewhere around in there, and it was uncovered as a result of recent hurricanes.
Oh, yeah.
And that's more than likely why this headstone appeared when nobody had actually seen it before, is because, it's not very deep there.
No, and the sand is constantly shifting because of these natural factors. The natural erosion, the hurricanes moving sand around. So it is entirely possible that something could get uncovered at some point where they're like, oh no, we need to get in there and either cover it back up or take care of this, because it's just it's not protected. It's not safe anymore for it.
Right. All right. Well, that's pretty much all we've got this week. We'll be back next week with more news articles or something.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Archaeology Show. Feel free to comment and view the show notes on the website at www.arcpodnet.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ArcPodNet. Music for this show is called I Wish You Would Look from the band Sea Hero. Again, thanks for listening and have an awesome day. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop the latest school styles with an extra 25% off during Tanger Style, our biggest sale of the season, now through August 25th. Plan your trip at tanger.com.